Would you say the same thing about business? Like, do you have to be in Silicon Valley to start a software company?
The particular day I went there was incredibly dreary there. And so it's like,
Now, what are the fields now that have a bunch of low-hanging fruits? First
was, I just delivered a big fruit tree.
Yeah.
And the test whether you understand what's going on is,
and again, how should we learn in this new age of AI? What should we focus on? What should we stop focusing on?
for example, the people with MBAs have a terrible habit of uniformly failing.
But what kind of people would you choose? What kind of people are you looking for? So how do you see the job of being a CEO versus being a researcher? Is it like, how would you today build a higher education institution?
A lot of the value of the fanciest, Ivy League places is networking.
To know, like, do you get bored? Do you get a headache? Do you have do you struggle sometimes with work?
I'm something of a procrastinator. I don't understand it. I don't believe it.
Yeah.
I seem to mostly hang out around 80 and 90-year-olds because I kind of felt,
Are there the Stephen Wolfram axioms? Like, don't believe it if you don't understand. Yeah. Anyways, last question and most important question of the interview. First of all, let me say thank you to everyone here. Thank you to Stephanie. Thank you to you for this amazing summer school. This has been amazing. And I'll make sure to spread the word around about how amazing the summer school is.
Good.
So for the past few days, I've been talking to most of the attendants here in the Wolfram Summer School to get a feel of what they'd like to ask. So I talked to 47 attendants of the summer school to get a feeling of what they're interested in asking you. And by far, the number one question, which might seem a bit too philosophical for the beginning, is, why do you have a pilot's license?
I had long ago, I learned to fly little planes. It turned out to be, why did I do it? Okay, the real reason I did it was a very bizarre story. Okay, I was working at Caltech and I had developed this software system that was a kind of forerunner of Wolfram language. And at some moment, I got involved in this whole mess with intellectual property and things like this. And so long story short, at some moment I said, okay, even though it's the middle of a semester and things like that, I'm quitting. So I had this kind of 2-week period when I was kind of like, well, I'm not supposed to be doing anything. I think that was the last time I ever took something that could readily be described as a vacation. And that was 45 years ago.
Yeah.
So, but
I was very surprised to hear that.
What's that?
I was very surprised to hear that, and everybody else was very surprised to hear that.
Right. So that was the time when I decided I would learn to fly small planes. I thought this is going to be super useful. I'm going to be able to zip around everywhere. But turns out it's not, because unless you spend a huge amount of time flying planes, you only get rated for flying when there aren't clouds around and things like this.
Okay.
And it was never useful. But it was interesting for several reasons, for several conceptual reasons. One was, okay, I think I know a whole bunch of stuff about physics. That means anything about how planes work, I should be able to figure out. I should know how this works. And it was always interesting to me that all these different effects, there'd be 3 different effects. Like when you take a plane off, little plane with a propeller, you have to press the right rudder to prevent the plane going off in the wrong direction. Okay, why is that? Well, there are 3 effects. There's moving an angular momentum vector. There's, air hitting the tail of the plane. There's another effect with the wings. And I realized that even though I know all this fancy physics, didn't actually help me in figuring out, do you press the right rudder or the left rudder?
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about things that you know more about. This was just a
okay. This was a starter.
No,
I will say about little planes that the other thing was interesting was the whole concept of checklists and how do you set things up so that you don't make a mistake.
Yeah,
it's an interesting process. And I've sometimes when I see people who are very disorganized, I say to them, you should go learn to fly planes.
Yeah.
It's a kind of way to learn sort of how to be organized, or maybe a natural selection way of doing that.
Yeah, we'll ask you more about it at the end.
Okay.
But actually, most questions I got that people wanted to ask you is more about advice. Almost every question was about what they should do in their research life, industry life, or about starting their own business. So I'm going to go through each one of them one by one and ask you questions about research, industry, and starting an own business. So many people here are thinking of doing a PhD and doing research. And many of them think that doing research in academia is not ideal and at the same time doing research at a private business is not ideal. I heard someone say that doing research at academia is too useless, and it's too rigid of a structure to actually pursue revolutionary ideas. And doing private research is sometimes too boring, and you don't get to work on interesting stuff. So how do we solve this dilemma? What can the students do that are interested in doing research?
Right. It's complicated. And I mean, I think that, if you're lucky, there is an institutional structure that fits the things you want to do, in which case you can be part of that institutional structure, sit back, let the institutional structure run itself, and you do what you want to do. If you want to do something that is sort of too innovative for the institutional structure, that's a complicated story. And that sometimes becomes a story of sort of, be an entrepreneur within academia, for example, be an entrepreneur in the traditional business kind of sense. But it really, or decide that you can kind of, get away with doing something which is kind of institutionally aligned while still having a sideshow of the thing that you want to do. But I don't think there isn't a great solution. And the story of who gets to do research in the world is a complicated one. It's evolved over the years. Universities are in the US at least, are the primary place where research gets done. There's some companies do a certain amount of research. It's complicated to know. Again, it depends what the research is. If the research is something that leads to technology, leads to a product, that's one kind of thing. If the research is pure kind of intellectual interest, that's another kind of thing. And in the pure intellectual interest area, it's like, why should society or anything else support that? And that's the challenge. And you have to find some niche where, for one reason or another, society is supporting that.
Okay. Do you know of a certain niche today that's interesting to society and is also intellectually very interesting?
Well, I mean, like with our Wolfram Institute, we're trying to build a little such niche.
Okay.
But it's not the right now. I mean, it depends much more on what particular area of research somebody is pursuing, because there are reasons why something will be being done somewhere that are sometimes the reasons are a little bit off what your actual motivation is, and that eventually can cause trouble. But maybe it's close enough that it's going to work.
Yeah, many people here are interested in working at the Wolfram Institute, but I'll get to that later. Okay, but many people also are thinking, where's the right place to pursue your research? Can it be anywhere, or does it have to be, especially in the US? And while you're answering that, maybe you can tell us, why did you decide to move to the US back then? Do you have to move to the place where the action is happening, or could you do cool things all around the world?
Well, I mean, I moved to the US in 1978 because I was doing physics kinds of things, and the US was the place where sort of frontline physics was happening. That was the sort of beginning and end of that story. I mean, I was living in England, and I actually considered going back to England 2 or 3 years after I moved to the US. And people I knew in England would say, "Oh no, you don't want to come back here. There's nothing exciting going on here." I think that the world has changed quite a lot, because in those days you had to be somewhere to be exposed to what was happening there. Today, there's live streams and the web and all these kinds of things are sort of what's there. And so you don't have to be in a particular place. The main thing that happens in particular places is people's personal motivation. I mean, there are people like myself, for example, where I've been in places where there are lots of people doing things that I'm interested in and so on, and I get sort of stimulated by that. But then for me, I've got enough internal kind of drive and internal interest that I'm perfectly happy to be off on my own, just doing my thing and figuring stuff out. And like when I was working on the new kind of science book, that was a 10-year story of me being sort of on my own working on things. And I think it is certainly possible to do that now in a way that it wasn't before. I mean, you can be anywhere, and you can be writing papers, and you can be interacting with people and so on. The question is, are you motivated to do that without other people around? I mean, I noticed for our company, which is a very geo-distributed company, some people do great just being on their own. Just leave me alone. I want to get my work done. Other people really need the kind of the interaction with people to get motivated. So I think that's it's really a question of partly a personal motivation. It's also sometimes a question of sort of the expectations that get set. If you're in some place where everybody is like doing things very carefully and well, and so on and so on and so on, you get the idea that's the thing you do, as opposed to just, well, all I ever see is, what's on Instagram or something, in which case you may not get the right view of, what's actually going on, so to speak.
Yeah. Would you say the same thing about business? Like, do you have to be in Silicon Valley to start a software company? Or is it the same thing that everything's distributed and live streamed? And if you have enough motivation, it's fine?
I think that in starting companies, there's the extra dynamic of investors. If you're going to get investment money, I mean, that's a thing where in the past, investors, pre-pandemic actually, investors were like, we only want to invest in something we can drive to in half an hour or something. I think that's largely, as far as I can tell, that's largely dissipated, but a lot of that dynamic is an in-person, who do you know, who did you run into at this event, and so on. I mean, I think that there are these areas, there are these things where sort of everybody gets the vibe of a particular direction that you can go, and that's happened in Silicon Valley. I mean, Silicon Valley is, startup town. You go into any Starbucks, every conversation fragment is about, a Series A or a MVP or a whatever else. And I think that's, and unfortunately that means, among other things, many people who shouldn't be doing startups say that's the thing you do. Everybody does a startup. I should do a startup. That's everybody should be doing this, and sometimes they shouldn't be. So I think, but in terms of, do you have to be in Silicon Valley to do a frontline startup? No, you don't. But you have to have you have to know that story, so to speak, to be able to do it. I mean, I notice, in the past, going around like the Consumer Electronics Show, you would see these areas where there was the French pavilion and the British, the Irish pavilion, and this and that and the other. And you look at a lot of these companies, and they're idiosyncratic in ways that are, maybe would be successful, but they're definitely idiosyncratic. They definitely had the vibe that wasn't the Silicon Valley vibe. And the Silicon Valley vibe is one that has been quite successful, and people have gotten used to that kind of vibe. And I suppose that's a thing. But for myself, the two main companies that I've started, first one in 1981, second one in 1986. The one in 1986 is the one I'm still running today. Neither of those was started in Silicon Valley.
Okay.
And I considered actually moving my current company to Silicon Valley in 1991, I think. And I was just a funny story. There's a particular place called Half Moon Bay, which is away from the main sort of area of San Francisco. And I thought, let me go check this out. The particular day I went there was incredibly dreary there. And so it's like, no, this is not a thing. So I didn't move the company to Silicon Valley, and I'm very glad about that, because, if you're trying to do things that are, in the swirl and where sort of things are happening every week and so on, then Silicon Valley is a place where things happen every week. But if you want to have something which is a longer term story, then it's actually a good thing to be away from Silicon Valley and away from kind of the dynamics of people in Silicon Valley, expectations in Silicon Valley, and so on.
Okay. That's very insightful. Okay, but what about the people that want to do research? Many people want to do research here. And I remember you once saying that in the 1960s, the whole field of physics had a bunch of low-hanging fruits. So two questions now. What are the fields now that have a bunch of low-hanging fruits? First question. Second question, how do you identify these overlooked fields that have low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, well, so I mean, okay, first point, what has low-hanging fruit? So I mean, I think a lot of things I've been involved in trying to initiate have low-hanging fruit. And that's sort of the point of these, that was originally the point of these summer schools when we started them in 2003, was, I just delivered a big fruit tree of a new kind of science, which has a lot of low-hanging fruit, which has continued, the whole computational paradigm, apply computation to thing X where it hasn't been applied before. Lots of low-hanging fruit in those areas. Okay. And understand things foundationally that it hasn't been possible to understand foundationally before. On the research side, I think that's the biggest collection of opportunities, is use computation as a foundational way to understand a field, understand the foundations of that field. That's a very powerful kind of thing to be exploring.
Could you give us an example of where that was successfully applied?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to do that in physics with our physics project, trying to do that in mathematics with the things I've done in metamathematics, in biology, things I've been doing recently on biological evolution, things, I've been talking about doing this for economics, but I keep on talking about it and I haven't done it yet.
Oh,
So,
I think many people are interested in helping
right.
you build that up.
Right. So I mean, and there's things in neuroscience, linguistics, you can keep going. I mean, a lot of fields where there is confusion about the foundation of the field. Physics had been a field which didn't think it had a confusion about the foundations of the field.
Yeah.
Although I think in modern times there's more recognition that it's kind of like the foundations aren't understood. But I think, so those are examples in the sort of deep research kinds of areas. But in the more kind of, I would say less, really going down to the foundations, sort of applying computation to pretty much any field, whether it's a field in the humanities, whether it's some area of something, I don't know, some traditional scientific field where, like life sciences, like chemistry, things like this, where there are only, where using computation as a paradigmatic idea hasn't been as explored as it could be. So those are places where kind of, there's just tons of opportunity.
Okay.
Now, it's always non-trivial because once fields get big, they sort of develop this whole structure and it's hard to be innovative in those fields. So the trick is, where can you find a computational X where there isn't yet much literature about that computational X?
Yes.
I think in the terms of the kinds of things I've been specifically working on, all of this, apply computation as a foundational part of some field. That's remarkably open. Apply, sort of think about computation as a scientific question in its own right. What I've been calling ruleology, the study of simple rules and what they do.
Yeah.
That's something that's just incredibly wide open. And it's one of these areas where sort of by its nature, there's just a lot to do. There are many, many simple rules to study, so to speak. It's kind of like chemistry, late 1800s. There were just many chemicals to study. And the things that you get, some of them will turn out to be super useful chemicals. Some of them will just turn out to be kind of interesting and sit in a textbook somewhere. But that's a type of thing that I think is, very, very wide open kind of area.
So the formula is applied computation to study the foundations of a field that hasn't been researched or studied before with computation.
I think that's a good general approach. I mean, I think that, but it's always complicated because people are, some of these things require more personal strength than others. I mean, some of them you're really going to be building a thing where everybody's going to say, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
Because either you're, it's often a trade-off. You can be in a field where lots of people are there, like machine learning today. Lots and lots of people are doing things, endless papers about LLMs and so on. And, if you are doing well and are methodologically good, you can perhaps jump ahead of the pack and do something that is like people say, wow, that's interesting. But you are necessarily competing with, 10,000 other people who are rushing in the same direction.
So there is low-hanging fruit, but there's a lot of competition to pick up the low-hanging fruit.
But if you pick it, then people know it was important. Plan B is you're working in some area where there's nobody else working on it, total backwater. People are saying, what are you working on? Well, that's kind of a crazy thing to be working in.
Yeah.
Those are the ones I prefer because for me, it feels more special if I'm inventing something that, if I hadn't invented it, nobody would have gotten around to it for decades or whatever. And, if you are, for my particular personality, it's just a better match to be working on these areas where people don't, where the world doesn't yet care.
Yeah.
And I can build something which I feel egotistically sort of special in being able to build. And then you have the effort of telling the world why they should care.
Yeah.
If you're working in a very popular area, the world, and you figure something out, everybody's going to say, oh yeah, we know why that's important.
But the word's going to be worth it after the hard work.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, particularly if you can make it all work.
Okay.
I mean, that's the, and that sometimes takes a fair amount of tenacity to actually get to the place where you have something to say. And people will often, in terms of research, one of the things that I think is important is kind of, can you explain what you're talking about?
Yeah.
People are like, oh, I'm floating at this very technical level. I'm doing this very technical thing. And it's like, then you probably don't really understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And the test whether you understand what's going on is, can you explain it? Okay. Even to yourself. I mean, when I do research, a lot of what I'm doing, I start writing about things fairly early in the process, partly because that's my way of knowing that I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess both writing Wolfram language code and writing English these are both things that are very good sort of feedback mechanisms for me to kind of, have clarified my thoughts and know that I know what I'm talking about.
Okay, we got the formula. And I think many people are going to be interested in pursuing such projects of applying computation to other fields. But I want to get to another question. A few days ago, I asked you in the lounge, so what kind of knowledge, so what will change now with the recent changes in AI? What are the new things that we have to learn and the things that we do not have to learn anymore? And I told some people about the answer you told me, and most of them were very surprised by the answer. So I'd like to ask you the question again. How should we learn in this new age of AI? What should we focus on? What should we stop focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably what I was talking about was kind of be generalists.
Yes,
I
yes.
mean, people have imagined for the last, I don't know, probably it's been a century roughly. People have been saying, the thing to do is to be the most specialized you can and to, learn the most technical things you can in some particular area.
Yeah.
That I think is probably decreasingly useful because a lot of what you're learning is techniques for doing things that are sort of things that can be automated and things where, whether it's the AI or whether it's our computational language or whatever, you can just do it that way. What is more important is less how good you are at answering the question than how good you are at figuring out what question to ask. And that sort of upstream thing of, for example, what question to ask, that's all about kind of knowing more stuff so you can get an idea of what question even might be there to ask. And I think, for people at the college level, for example, right now, take a bunch of courses and a bunch of random things. You'll find out that, it sort of expands the way you think about things. I mean, another thing worth realizing is every field has a different way of thinking about things. If you're a pure mathematician, you think in terms of, what can I prove a theorem about? If you're a medical researcher, you think about, what clinical trial can I expect to do? Very different kinds of thinking and very different kinds of intuition about what's going to work. Like in medicine, there's always footnotes. The only way you can tell what happens is to do the clinical trial. Whereas in physics or something, it's like you can get the clear sort of definitive answer, and you can expect it to be simple. So I think the first thing is learn a bunch of different things. The second thing is kind of, people wonder, should you just learn kind of the skills level, or should you learn the facts? Learning facts is really useful because the facts are sort of the anchors that allow you to understand principles.
Yes.
If you're just sort of floating in these principles, it's very hard to make that work. And I know for myself, it's like knowing facts about a bunch of different areas. That's how I can really make use of the things from those areas when it comes to applying them in a different place. And without the facts, it would just be sort of floating.
I understand. But I feel like the job market does not reward that. And I heard the same thing from another attendant here. The job market does not reward you for being a generalist. It's very hard to find jobs if you're a generalist. Like if someone else is competing against you for the same job that's a specialist, you probably won't get the job because you spent more time doing other things.
But it depends on the organization you're dealing with. I mean, and it depends on what the job is. If the job is kind of a plug compatible, I'm going to be implementing, a Kubernetes container architecture for this or that thing. Sometimes, I mean, this is the thing that happens in software engineering quite a bit. There'll be these areas of software engineering where it's the first person who learned JavaScript. It's the first person who learned, containerization or something. And for a little while, there's a sort of bubble that happens of, there were only 100 people in the world who learned how to do this. And, they get fantastic jobs. But the fact is, in my experience, it's a very common thing. We say, we're not going to pay for one of those 100 people who was the first person in the world who learned this thing. We're just going to find a smart person and say, why don't you go read the book about this and, then do it. That works really well. I mean, there are areas where sort of the experience is useful, but I think, if you're applying for a job where it says, where you are supposed to plug into this plug compatible slot and you can have been educated to be able to plug into that plug compatible slot, that's one thing. I don't think those are the most interesting jobs for most people. I mean, this is the thing with kind of, like business school, for example. MBAs sort of qualify people often to be able to be plug compatible in certain kinds of organizations. In our organization, for example, the people with MBAs have a terrible habit of uniformly failing because our organization is just not one where that particular plug fits
Yeah.
in what we're doing. So I think, I think the thing is that, in terms of people kind of looking for jobs, whatever, I mean, it's often, the mechanical job, which is plug compatible. Yes, if you have the specific experience of that particular thing, then many companies will be like, okay, great, we want you because you have that specific experience. You're probably charging the company a lot because you have that very specific experience. I think the alternative is kind of, you can communicate that you can figure out a lot of stuff. And many companies know that it's not always going to be the same thing. It's not
Yeah.
going to be this project, and you're always going to be working on that project. So, and I think, in how you present yourself, it's, I would say, I haven't been doing this for a while, but I used to, read lots of resumes and read lots of cover letters and so on. And the cover letter that begins, I would like to work for your company where I can use what I learned in my bachelor's degree about blah, 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 blah. These are usually, this is not a good, at least for a company like ours, it's not a good pitch. It's kind of like, I got this qualification, therefore I can be productive in your company. And it's like, maybe not. There may be people who can just learn sort of the parrot-like, they can learn certain kinds of things to do. And whenever whenever something comes up that isn't exactly what they learnt, they're kind of, that they're toast.
Yeah.
And that's, for a company like ours, at least, one wants people who are flexibly able to do different things. I mean, there's some companies where it really is regimented to the point where you just want this plug compatible person. Maybe you only want them for 2 years, because then you're going to change direction. You lay all those people off, you get another set of plug compatible people that do a different kind of thing.
Yeah.
But that's, that it depends on the nature of the company. But I would say that sort of selling yourself to an organization is about kind of, is about explaining how you can be useful to that organization, not I am this particular kind of plug, and I'm going to describe what kind of plug I am, and and therefore I should be a fit.
I'm very glad to hear that, because I like learning about a million other fields, so I like hearing that. Okay, but what about the people who want to go into industry? We talked a little bit about research. Some people are considering working at a startup versus a big company. Is there any input you could give these people who are interested in, who are considering these two choices?
It depends. Well, there's three things. There's work in a big company, there's work in a startup, and there's start a startup.
Yes.
And they're all a bit different.
Yes.
Right. And so, in the work in a big company, it can be very comfortable. I mean, in other words, you get involved in this company, it's got you're a software engineer 1, then in a few years you'll be a software engineer 2. You go on, you'll be a 3, a 4, whatever else, then you'll be a principal engineer or something. And the whole thing is mapped out. And it isn't something you have to think about.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like in my life, I spend a bunch of effort thinking about intellectual things, but if it's what am I going to eat for breakfast, I eat the same thing for breakfast every day. It's something I don't think about.
Yeah.
If you want a life where you just don't have to think about what's going to happen in your job, then working for a big company can be a good thing. And it's also something where it's very structured. You kind of know what you're supposed to do. You know what the expectations are. Often in the reality, particularly if you're trying to climb up in a big company, it's deeply internally political. And it's much more, it's much less about did you do a great job than did you do the right sort of internal political dynamics to get people to promote you. So that's and it's often, it can be very frustrating working in a big company because you have absolutely no control about what happens. I mean, you can sit back, relax, and be there for the ride. But if you actually care about the project you're working on, that project might just be canceled because something happens, some glitch happens in some meeting of people who are 4 levels above you in the management hierarchy. You'll never even know what it was. All you'll know is your project got canceled. And that's sort of not a good thing. If you care about your project, if you care about just, I'm going to do a job where I don't have to think too much about what I'm doing, that doesn't really matter. When it comes to working in startups, it depends how big the startup is. It depends whether you know the people who started the startup. I mean, startups, again, if you are employee number 20 in a startup, for example, you don't have a lot of control typically unless you rapidly ascend to be a C-level exec in the startup, you don't typically have a lot of control over what happens. And startups do crazy things and fail for all kinds of reasons, and you can put a huge amount of effort into the thing and then it fails. On the other hand, as a social human dynamic, startups are I think you get to see a lot of good features of the human condition, as well as maybe some bad ones. But in startups, there's a lot of energy, a lot of kind of people really caring about what they're doing. It's I think it's very energizing for people. It's very kind of, we know what the aspiration is, and so on and so on and so on. The startup may also go off the rails and fail, but it's an energizing thing to be part of.
Okay, I understand.
Now when it comes to starting your own startup, that's yet a different thing.
Okay.
Because then you are in control of your destiny. I mean, there might be investors who are slightly try and pull strings, but fundamentally you're in control of your destiny. And you might be a person for whom it's not, some people it's very stressful to be, in charge. It's like, well, I might make a mistake. And then all these people will lose their jobs, and I'll be, destitute, and people will think, I'm a failure, and so on. And that can be stressful for people. Other people, it's like the thing I like most is being in control of my own destiny, and I just don't want to be told what to do, or I don't want to have to agree with other people what I have to do. I just want to be in charge. That's kind of my case probably. But I think then you have to understand things about starting companies. It's a lot of work. People who say, "Oh, I'm just going to start this company. It's going to be easy." It's never easy.
Is it always a full-time or overtime commitment even?
I think so.
Think so?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, in modern times, the idea that people can do multiple jobs, I think it's partly because of automation that's even conceivable. But, I remember when the first time when people were CEOs of multiple companies, I think Steve Jobs was one of the first people I knew who actually was CEOing Next and Pixar, right? And people were like, this couldn't possibly work. But he managed to make it work, and you can see now in modern times, one can CEO more than one company, although there's typically some sort of common infrastructure and common themes and so on between those. But I think people, so except in those cases, I would say it's let me put it this way: you have to be fully committed to the startup, whether your actual time is spent, if you're not able to spend all your time on it because, well, you're doing this other startup as well, or you're doing this other company as well, that's a different thing. But emotionally, you have to be really committed to it. And I think you have to be, I've seen many cases when people are like, oh, it's easy, I'm going to do this. I've even done that myself one time. It's going to be easy. And then you just don't have enough drive to make the thing actually work, because there are always problems. And there are always, if you're trying to do something that, well, you've never done it before, and quite possibly nobody's ever done it before, and it takes a lot of pushing to get it to happen. I mean, I think the thing that people have to recognize also about companies they start. So one feature about companies people start, if you don't want the product the company is making, you probably shouldn't be starting that company. If you don't want the thing that you are imagining the company to do, then you'll never have quite that interest in it. I mean, I have seen some people who manage to start companies successfully in that mode, but usually the thing they're really thinking about is sort of the financial shenanigans of the whole thing, not what the company makes. They're just, what the company makes is just a side effect of this clever financial, thing that they're doing. And I think, then, so you have to care about what the company is making. The company will inevitably reflect your personality. This is another thing where people say, well, I know about this, but of course, or I do things this way, but I'm going to make my company do something completely different. My company is going to be very different from me. Never works that way. People, it's always, whether the person is a sort of an R&D, oriented character like myself, or whether somebody is a very commercial, I'm going to sell the customers, I'm really good at being in the room and convincing the customers to do things. Each of those sort of traits of the founder of the company will get imprinted on the company, and there's not a lot you can do about it.
Okay.
And when people try, it doesn't go well.
Okay. Now, just one more question before we switch to the next topic. Many of the students I talk to here are very interested in continuing their affiliation and their work with Wolfram Institute or Wolfram Research after the summer school. So what's their guide on to continuing their work or their career here?
Talk to us about it. I mean, it's a, I think what we've done. So our company is actually in a very interesting position because we are just finishing a whole bunch of projects, which for some reason are all getting finished at about the same time, including ones that we've been working on for a decade or more. And so it's kind of an interesting time for me because I'm really thinking about, okay, let me refactor what's going on, because we don't just want, when a project gets finished, one natural tendency of companies is just keep maintaining that thing. But it's a bad thing, both for the people involved and for the company. And so it's really a question of, so what do you strategically want to do? And I've spent a lot of my time in, thinking about strategies for companies. And I've been, an advisor to zillions of companies thinking about their strategies and so on.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting moment for me because I get to sort of think about a bunch of strategic questions for our company. So that's so they're going to be some interesting, I think, opportunities there. With the Wolfram Institute, this is another kind of gestational kind of thing because we started Wolfram Institute a couple of years ago. We've been, it's got some funding and it's got sort of the ability to sort of energize. The question really there is, okay, so how should you organize it? I feel pretty good about the organization of our company and the fact that we managed to be productive and innovative over a long period of time. I think I understand how to manage an organization like that. I'm not completely sure I know how to manage an institute. I mean, I tried once before in the mid-1980s. I started an institute for concentrating on complexity kinds of things. It was not, although I had a bunch of good people there and they did interesting things later in the world, so to speak, I would say for me, it was not a very satisfactory experience because it was like, why am I here? I'm just here as the organizer, not as something where there's sort of an intellectual direction that's being defined. So for our Wolfram Institute, we've kind of figured out, I think, sort of a strategic setup for how it's going to work. And, it's kind of like there's 4 buckets of things. There's kind of projects I'm doing where I'm hoping to get people who can help me do those projects, and where they can take what they did with me and go off and write their own papers or whatever else. That's bucket number 1. Bucket number 2 is bridge projects, taking things that we've kind of figured out and bridging them to lots of different academic and other fields. Because one thing that happens is you write something about something foundational about a field, and there are incumbents in that field, and they don't, to explain that new foundational idea takes a whole bunch of effort. It has to be done within the context and even the kind of social dynamic of that particular field. And so that's another sort of big activity. Then there's also developing tools and doing outreach. These are sort of our 4 buckets of activity that we're my current theory of the strategy of our institute.
Yeah. So concretely, people should they come to you or should they come to their mentors and then it will reach you?
I don't know.
Okay.
The mentor's a good start. I'm always I'm easy to find at the summer school.
I'm surprised by that. Thank you very much for giving us so much of your time.
Well,
Okay.
it's this year is actually fairly good because I'm sort of between big projects, sort of, even though so other years it's been more stressful for me.
Yeah.
Dealing with the worst was 2009, where we did the summer school, and it's the only time we've done it outside the US. We did it in Italy, and it was, we had carefully set it up 9 months before we did it, and it turned out to happen 2 weeks after we released Wolfram Alpha, and it was terrible because, I was dealing with bad cell phone connections and trying to solve technology problems, solve business problems, and so on. It was not a good experience.
Yeah,
but
I hope it stays this way. It has been fantastic so far.
Yeah.
But what kind of people would you choose? What kind of people are you looking for to work at the company or the institute?
I mean, it's sort of people who are capable of doing things in a sort of innovative and self-driven way, and who are capable of doing high quality work, which is not always, that's not always a thing. Like in education these days, it's kind of like, well, if I do this and this and this, I'll get a B and it's okay. As far as I'm concerned, getting a B and it's okay isn't okay. A lot of the things we're doing, really, you have to do the, even if it takes a bit longer or something, it's really important that you can actually do it right. I would say that I mean, there's much more detail about kind of different things that we're looking for. I would say that in the company, we're particularly mostly right now, probably if I was to say the main emphasis is more on getting the word out than it is on building yet more technology, although we are building a bunch of more technology and we'll continue to do that. But we have a mismatch between the extent to which what we've built and what people know we've built.
Yes.
And so that's the thing that I'm trying to fix. And that's a slightly different twist. With respect to the Institute, I think there are places there where there's specific, sophisticated expertise that I'm interested in, particularly both things that complement things that I know about and things where it plugs into these different academic fields and so on, where somebody can be a player in one of these academic fields and can kind of communicate in the terms that are needed in that field.
Okay, I understand. Okay, now I'm gonna close this topic. And so most people, they think of researchers and CEOs and founders as two separate kinds of people. And I think you're a counterexample to the stereotype. So how do you see the job of being a CEO versus being a researcher? Is it like, does it require two distinct personality types, or are there synergies between them? What do you think about that?
Well, I think it depends how you do each of these things. I mean, so sort of knowing what the point is important in at least my way of doing these things. That is sort of research. To do it well, it's a lot about strategy. It's a lot about kind of, what is the key thing I'm trying to do? Same thing with CEOing. I mean, it's a lot about that. Now, there's machinery in both cases. Like in the research business, there's a certain amount of detailed work that is a little different from the CEOing business. I have spent a lot of my life trying to automate that detailed work, and it really helps that I'm sort of a pretty fluent user of the language I've just spent the last 40 years building. And so that's a different, when I'm sitting by myself, writing Wolfram language code or writing some piece that I'm writing, that's a different kind of experience than being in meetings with people, doing CEOing. But the kind of core intellectual part of it, which is sort of what's the point? How do I drill down? How do I get to the sort of strategic direction that I want to get to? That's surprisingly similar. I mean, on the CEOing side, I suppose I've always been kind of fortunate or something that it's always seemed to me that sort of business strategy is kind of just common sense. Now, I don't know whether I don't think that's really true. I think it's that I happen to be reasonably good at it. And so I've never identified it as being a thing that's a big sort of effort to do it.
I feel like that's the skill that the free market rewards most in the world. So it can't be that common if the world rewards it that much.
Well, maybe that's true. I mean, I think, when I started my first company, one of the mistakes that I made was, I was sort of a physics person and so on, and I kind of assumed that I wouldn't know anything about running businesses, which turned out not really to be true.
Yeah.
But I really do feel like, look, the main thing about running businesses is, can you keep your sort of thinking apparatus engaged on all the issues that come up? Because CEOing is a very sort of multifaceted kind of thing. So is doing good research. I mean, I think it's a lot of these things, you have input from lots of different places, and you have to have, a range of skills. But people, particularly people who are on the research side and they've drilled down into some particular thing and so on, when it comes to CEOing, they just seem to switch their brains off. I mean, it's crazy because I see this, in companies that I interact with and so on. It's like, somebody will be a very talented, smart researcher, and then they start a company and they have some crazy personnel problem. And it's like, well, why don't you just think about, what can you do? How do you, you've got these sort of puzzle pieces. How do you fit them together? It's like when you lead them through it, it's like, oh, and you realize it's the same thinking pattern. It's not it's not really a different thinking pattern. It's just for some reason they said, well, I can solve math problems, but nobody ever told me how to solve a personnel problem with people. Now, I suppose the other thing that is interesting and maybe different is you know, most people who run companies have to reasonably much like dealing with people. And I find people interesting. I like interacting with people. That's a good attribute if you're running a company. I mean, it is possible to do it while not really liking people very much, but I think it is more difficult. And I think that that's a dynamic which is, well, what happens in both cases is
Yeah.
to assess people well enough to know what is it that it's worth asking them to do. Because it's no good if you say to somebody, you should be doing this, and it's just something they just absolutely can't do. That will never end well. And it's also so being able to make enough of an assessment, being able to understand enough about people to know, like for example, the thing I'm trying to do with our company right now of refactoring a lot of things we're doing, a lot of that is a complicated people juggling story of, and it's quite an interesting problem really, because it's like you have these people, they're very talented, they're doing this thing. There's some other thing which you've thought could be done. And it's like, well, can I think about, this person doing this other thing? And it's like, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. It's kind of like it feels very much like a sort of research breakthrough type thing.
I feel like technical people underestimate how hard this kind of work is. I feel like they always think that the technical work is the hardest thing in the world. It's the highest. Maybe that's why you're saying that's why some researchers don't perform as well when they're CEOs. I feel like they underestimate the job of
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, I don't know. Or they just feel like, or they overestimate it and they just say, I just can't do this, and they kind of give up. I mean, I think, for me, if I rank things I do in their sort of difficulty, I always find, like dealing with people in these situations, I don't find particularly difficult. I don't find sort of and what happens when you run companies and things is you end up making lots of decisions every day. It's like, do we do this? Do we do that? That's a very useful thing to learn, even when you're doing research, because many people who do research don't do that. They don't make decisions all the time. They don't sort of change the strategy. And that's something that, again, it's a shared trait between sort of successful efforts in both those areas. But I think, this whole thing about you you have to kind of you're constantly in this mode of making decisions about what to do, and it also helps if you have kind of a bigger picture goal for what you're trying to achieve.
yeah.
That helps guide that process.
Okay, I understand. Very interesting. Now, a completely different topic. I'm surprised by how many people are interested in education systems and how we can improve the current education systems. So, two questions. First one is a bit easy question. Second one, a bit harder. First question is, where do you see the value of Ivy League or some fancy other universities? Are they worth it? Are there any benefits? Are there downsides? That first question. Second question, how would you today build a higher education institution? Would you make it broader? Would you make it completely different? Imagine you had to build a university from, I don't want to even use the word university. Let's say you had to build a higher education institution from scratch. How would you go about it?
Okay, so first question about sort of how do you pick these different institutions and so on? I mean, I would say that it's complicated. I mean, a lot of the value of the fanciest, Ivy League places is networking. I mean, and that's relevant in some domains and not in others. If you're going to become an investment banker, if you're going to go into, politics of some kind, it's super useful to have gone to one of these schools and, oh yeah, I'm friends with this person, this person, this person. I mean, I myself had this sort of weird situation because in England, I went to the fancy schools. I went to a place called Eton and Oxford, which are sort of the fancy, sort of Ivy League-esque places. And not only that, I was also in sort of rather rarefied parts of those institutions. So I kind of, but then I left England. So, the people who are my contemporaries, the kids I knew in school, were running the country before too long, and which is a little bit scary in some ways. And I wouldn't necessarily have picked the ones who ended up doing it based on what I knew about them when they were kids. But then I made absolutely no use of that network. I mean, other than just for entertainment value, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, but had I been, in England trying to sort of do things that were sort of in the political arena and media and so on, then it probably would have been really useful. And if you're going to go into something which is a networking based field, then, finding a way to get that network card is useful. I don't think, when you ask about sort of the professors and things like this, yeah, I mean, got lots of friends who are professors at lots of the fancy schools. If you're actually being a student there, does it matter that there are fancy professors there? Sometimes it does. If the fancy professors are prepared to talk to the students because they find the students interesting, then that's great. But a lot of time, there can be a fancy professor who's on the letterhead, but they're always off, doing something else, and the students never even see them.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's a thing. I think when it comes to kind of there's another piece to the whole thing, which is that sometimes there's a certain cultural environment that exists at sort of some place, and people get sort of pulled along by that cultural environment,
Yes.
for better or worse. I mean, sometimes it's a very, you must achieve, or you must, and they're kind of like, so I've got to do this. I've got to go into some field where I can be, an achiever and so on. That's not necessarily the right thing for them. So I mean, I think the, in terms of just the education, I don't think the pure education is, is typically worth the trouble. I mean, there are very detailed things, like if you are trying to study math and you need to go to and you're going to be a professional mathematician, you need to go to a school where they have enough math classes that has to be a school of a certain size and certain type and so on.
Yeah.
But beyond dynamics like that, I think that oftentimes the best dynamic is to go to like liberal arts schools in the US or the big state universities and so on. I mean, again, it's a somewhat personality dependent thing. I also think that at most of these universities, it is more on the student to have a good time than it is on the university to kind of provide a good time. You see people who are at great universities where they should be doing great things, but oops, they never talk to a professor.
Yeah.
And that's and sometimes it's so I think that in terms of the college experience, the number one thing to say is actually talk to professors, because many students don't. In terms of starting a university, I've been sort of exposed to that question a bunch of times, and a bunch of people have said you should do that. You should start a university, and it's okay. Everybody has sort of theories about how education should work. And everybody like me at least has theories about how it should work. But I know that a lot of what's actually involved is very gritty and procedural and so on. I mean, in other words, when you get, I know people who've started universities in recent times, and some part of it is cerebral, intellectual, and some part of it is the grittiness about where are the students going to live, how is the how do you get your accreditation, how much do you have to distort what you say you're doing in order to get accredited? Why do you care about being accredited? Because in the US, there's a giant system about student loans and things, which depends on accreditation. It kind of cuts you out of a large part of the market if you're not accredited. So, but that then, forces you into certain kinds of things. Now, in terms of what I would say about what should happen and so on, I mean, I kind of feel, there are certainly subjects that are not adequately represented in universities. I mean, the whole universities are very confused about what to do about computation. I mean,
the computation is underrepresented in universities.
I don't know if it's underrepresented. It's strangely represented. Okay, so what happened is back in the day, 40 years ago, computer science departments were tiny operations doing theoretical kinds of things, or maybe they were doing electrical engineering, basically. Then there was this whole, computation is important. Everybody wants to learn about software and so on. And so then these universities were forced to dramatically expand their computer science departments. And the question is that the thing is, what really is important, in my view, is, computation as a paradigm and something where you're applying computation to all sorts of different areas. I mean, just like universities have a math department, but they also expect that math is going to be used in a bunch of areas. And it's the same kind of thing with computation. But what happened is people said, computation is important. Let's expand the computer science department. What does the computer science department teach? Most of what it teaches is how to program, for which, for example, going to a fancy, Ivy League school doesn't make any difference. You can learn to program in some boot camp somewhere. You can learn to program. Okay, most of the best programmers I know, in fact, almost all the best programmers I know, have basically never taken a computer science class. So, it's a thing where people learn to do it and they learn by doing. And it isn't a thing that, by the time you're teaching it, a lot of the time that's happening. So sometimes people do computer science just because it's easy for them to do it. But, quite a lot of the time, it's like by the time you have to teach the person to do it, they're not actually going to be very good at doing it. And what's happened in universities is this vast expansion in very trade school level sort of software engineering, which may all be getting automated. I mean, certainly the story of my life has been trying to automate that. And a lot of what people learn in computer science school, if they used our tech, they just wouldn't be doing those things.
Just by the way, I feel like in Europe we had almost zero programming classes. Almost everything was focused on theory. But from what I've heard here from the US students is that they have much more coding, and it's much more like a trade school than
Well,
what I saw in
Well,
Europe.
that's interesting. I mean, I think, it used to be theoretical in the US. Like
Yeah.
when I started our current company, nearly 40 years ago now, we would keep on having these people who had got PhDs in computer science, things like this, some undergraduate computer science people. And it's like, what did you learn? Well, we learned about compilers, we learned about automata theory. It's like, well, I like those things. Those are really cool, but they're also quite useless
Yeah.
for the point of view of, software developing software and so on. And I think, that was, but then there's this whole expansion of sort of the trade school area. And there's this question of what, it's a very strange thing because it's like computer science, it's like teaching people to write. You could spend all your time just teaching people to write, but then with nothing to write about. But it's all about teaching people to write.
Yeah.
Very strange situation. I mean, computer science has tended to add these extra little pieces like, robotics, machine learning, cryptography as sort of things to write about. But mostly those things have landed in computer science because nobody knew where else to put them.
Yeah.
I mean, if it was something where there was a well-established field, it was often that field. So I think, computer science has been, I think it's a strange thing that's all about sort of teaching software engineering. I think there's much more intellectually interesting things to teach there. I started writing a book about sort of introduction to computational thinking, intended as sort of a basic college textbook. I've been distracted with too many other things and haven't made progress on it. But that's an example of sort of a thing that I think should be there is, sort of computation as a foundational thing. I think that just like, people will learn about philosophy as a way to sort of learn about thinking.
Yeah.
I think they should learn about computation as a way to formalize how to think about things. And I think it's kind of a foundational skill,
Yeah.
and that isn't the way things have been typically organized.
Okay, but would you add other subjects like maths, physics, economics, liberal arts? I mean, what do you call them? Like arts subjects like politics and geography?
Sure. Sure. I mean, as I said, I think learning about more stuff is important. I think doing that within a computational paradigm is nice because computation is this kind of way of formalizing one's thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the but the problem is universities as a practical matter, we have this summer school which we've been doing now for 23 years. I think it's
Yes.
gone very well. It's we've thought about, can we scale this up? We started a high school program maybe a dozen years ago. That's doing really well. We've scaled that up, and we've got, sort of year-round high school programs. Those are doing well. We're slowly sort of easing into this place, but it's also difficult. Like, where do you plug? Let's say you're going to do some big initiative in higher education. How do you actually plug it in? Because what do people, is it the thing people do instead of college? Does that then, do you have the whole pipeline built where people then get jobs and so on? Quite possibly, yes. I've been certainly amused by these different things that have happened over the years. Like, for example, there was this period of time when people were quoting their, Udacity, courses ahead of their college degrees on LinkedIn and so on. That's stopped happening now. But the one thing that has happened, which I also find interesting, is people will say, they got a bachelor's degree in this year and they were in YC, Y
Yes.
Combinator, a particular year,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, I saw that from the very beginning, actually. Y Combinator started like a year after the summer school started, and I, saw it at the very beginning. And it's sort of interesting that that's become a successful sort of business school-ish dynamic, although more practical in many ways than business school. But that's an example of a sort of innovation in education that has worked out. I think that, if you're trying to plug in, if you have a bunch of innovative ideas about education, you have to know where in people's lives does that plug in.
I'm just assuming that we want the optimal case for get the system around. We just want to produce the most useful students. If each one of them were to start their own company, they don't have to plug into the existing systems.
That's
Yeah.
true. That's true. I mean, I think that that's in the theory of, it's would be, with Y Combinator, sort of the shtick is you're starting your own company.
Yes.
I think at the point where sort of everybody is going to start their own company, that's a certain set of people. I'm not even sure that they all fit together. In other words, what you have to, the person who's going to start their company doing, there's not a uniform set of things people have to learn. I mean, some people who are going to start companies need to learn a fair amount of intellectual, technical stuff. Other people don't have to learn anything about that. Some people, you need to try and teach them, how to do things involving people, and other people, it just comes completely naturally. I'm not sure that's a good organizing principle. I mean, I don't know, universities, it is a question. What is the organizing principle for who should go to a particular university?
It's like school, like everyone says you need to have a basic level of knowledge about geography, maths, and science. I don't know if you agree with that, but
I do. I do agree that everybody needs a basic level of knowledge about things. And the more knowledge you have of different things, the better off you are. And the more that people understand that, the theory, which by the way was a theory that was very prevalent in the past, is still somewhat prevalent, of you go to school when you're young, school is finished, you never have to learn anything again in your life.
now it's university.
What's that?
Now it's university. It's extended to
Yes,
university.
yes. When I say school, I'm using it in the
Oh,
American sense, which includes university. It's right. I mean, but people, this idea that you never have to learn anything else in your life is an idea that is, I think, increasingly clear that that's not. People have a better time if they keep learning, and people have better success typically if they keep learning and doing different things and so on.
Okay, that's very interesting. I'd love to ask you way more about that, but we have to switch topics. Now, something completely different. I'm surprised by how many people care about your other personal side. Like, people want to know the normal side of Steven. Many people want to know, like, do you get bored? Do you get a headache? Do you have, like, do you struggle sometimes with work that you have to take a break? Do you have problems? I don't know. Many people care about that.
Well, I care about that too. I mean, look, I'm a generally upbeat character,
Yeah.
which I'm a generally rather linear character in the sense that, I don't get terribly, oh my God, this is really, pushing down on me, nor do I get all that excited when things, go well. Okay, that's nice. Now I'm on to the next thing.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, I'm going to kind of, I think in, I mean, I'm I'm something of a procrastinator, which
Really?
seems surprising,
It is surprising.
given, I do a lot of stuff. It takes effort to get things started, and I've tried to, sometimes I think I'm a rational procrastinator in the following sense that, if I'm going to give a talk somewhere, sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm going to prepare this talk. And then I'll go to some event and I'll see the audience and I'm like, oh my gosh, the thing I prepared is just totally unsuitable for this audience. So it'd be much better if I hadn't prepared anything. And so that sort of Pavlovianly has made me say, I'm not going to prepare these things. Same thing with things like, oh, I don't know, we're building a product and it's like, oh, we should, design all this marketing material as we build it. Then when we actually finish the product, we realize actually the main point of it is something different from what we thought it was. So in that sense, I'm a rational procrastinator, and I think I've viscerally gotten fairly good at figuring out how long is it actually going to take to do this thing, and then I kind of leave it till the last minute often, and there's almost never a disaster. I'm trying to think how many, but what cases I can think of. No, things do get finished, but
Maybe the unconscious that calculates the optimal time to start
I
something.
think so. But then there are things where it's like I've been meaning to do this project for years. Can I actually get started on it? And then I guess eventually it tips over and I really do it, even though I feel like I've been procrastinating. I think I procrastinated the physics project for 20 years. But finally, various circumstances got me to say I'm going to do this now. I think in terms of there are things I do which are very, I mean, like for example, I get maybe 500 emails a day, and that's a lot of work to go through all of those.
Yeah.
And I try to, I do it responsibly, so to speak. I mean, I could just say, forget it, too many emails, I'm just going to delete them all. And it's complicated because there are internal ones, there are external ones. I have all these buckets to put this into, but then there'll always be a thing that jumps out of the bucket, like
Yeah.
because and that takes it takes some degree of sort of self discipline to just be prepared to sit down and I know I've got I'm backed up 1,000 emails or 1,500 emails or something that I have to grind through.
Do you have to exercise? Do you feel like you have to exercise discipline sometimes?
What's that?
Do you feel like you still have to exercise discipline sometimes to do things,
Sure.
important things?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, with respect to that kind of thing, sure. I mean, and then the worst thing is I'll go through email and I'll triage the ones that are easy to answer.
Yeah.
And then there'll be this sort of whole stack of older and older emails that have been sort of accumulating because they're more and more difficult to answer. And it takes a whole bunch of effort to go and sit down and go through those. In fact, I've tried to I use human babysitters a bit to do that. I mean, people I work with who it's useful because often I'll look at some piece of mail and it's like, what the heck am I going to do with this? This is and somebody else will say, oh, what about doing this with it? And maybe that isn't a good idea, maybe it is, but it kind of at least gets me, thinking about it.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Yeah. Now, still, we're gonna stay on the personal side. Many people are interested in what motivates you, especially like doing the summer school. What motivates you to do the summer school, and especially being so generous with your time? Thank you again for that, for being so generous with your time. So, what motivates you to do this summer school and being so generous with your time, and what motivates you in general to keep doing all of the things you're doing?
Well, I mean, with the summer school, I find you guys interesting. I mean, and I learn a whole bunch. I mean, every summer school, I learn tons of stuff. It also is a time I find it invigorating to kind of I mean, the sort of the pressure on me to come up with a whole bunch of projects is something that I find, interesting.
Yeah.
Plus, I'm kind of I'm always curious with all these projects. I'll come up with something. It's like I wonder what happens if you look at this, and this is sort of an excuse to do something. Where if it was just me myself, a lot of these projects I just wouldn't quite make the cut of something I'm going to make a big effort in.
Yeah.
But when there's sort of a somebody else who's involved and they're going to learn something from it, it makes sense. And sometimes the projects will end up being, well, actually, I should have made a big effort because it actually is a really cool thing to do.
Yeah.
But so, I learn a bunch of stuff. I think that also realistically, we have the alumni of our summer schools have lots of them work at our company, have been involved with things we do. It's a good network. It's kind of another thing is that, back a long time ago, I used to be a professor. I think I was not a very responsible professor. I was not that interested in teaching and things at that time. I became interested in those things over time. And for me, the summer school is sort of my few weeks of extreme professoring in the year gets my kind of professoring kind of itch, but it's a much more extreme version, I think, than the typical professor kind of thing. And I notice, I sometimes will go to events where there's sort of an educational thing, and the people, there'll be some sort of lecturers or something, and they'll all sit by themselves. And I'm always like, no, I want to talk to the students because they're the interesting people to talk to. And I don't know quite why that dynamic happens, but I always find it, I'm always interested in what sort of the fresh, new thinking about things and people. It sort of helps me. It invigorates me. In terms of motivation in general, for me, it's kind of usually, I mean, a funny thing that I've often, you know, am I an ambitious person? I never think so. One might think so based on the fact that I put a lot of effort into doing things which are sort of big, whatever things. But that's not usually the motivation. I mean, I'm usually like, I've gotten to this point where I feel like I can see a bunch of things to do, and I'm really interested in doing those things. I think that would be really interesting. I think that would be something kind of, and I also, at some level, I feel a responsibility sometimes to do
Mm.
things. Like I feel like, okay, I can see how this works. I've got the best shot anybody's had in 100 years to do this. You know, really, should I be irresponsible enough to not try and do it? And so then I try and do it, and and then it's fun to do it. I don't think, there's some people who get a lot of sort of energy out of the sort of competitive aspect of doing things.
Yes.
That is not my thing at all. In fact, I really dislike that, because for me, if I'm sort of in competition with somebody to do something, it's like, why am I doing this? Why don't I just let them do it?
Yeah.
There's nothing special. I don't feel special, and it doesn't egotistically find it satisfying if it's like, well, they would do it if I didn't do it.
Yeah.
So I think that's it's always been, in cases where that comes up, it's very demotivating to me, and it tends to be, kind of I'll just avoid it, or I'll get really annoyed about it, and it just doesn't have a positive outcome. I mean, it's usually that I'm motivated to do things just because I think that will be a cool thing to do, and it's not. It's not. It's in a sense. It's. I mean, once I'm at some level on sort of tower of things one can figure out that one can do. As I say, it's just like I've just got to go. I've got to go do that. I mean, how could I not do that? I mean, like in these things where figure out something. Well, like in this area of economics, where people keep on telling me, and I keep on thinking there's something really interesting to find there, and I'm going to do it because I have to do it. It's not something where I might do it, I might not. Now, there are things on the more. I mean, I like to build products where I want to use that product. Occasionally, we do things where that isn't the case. Like, for example, right now, we're building an AI-based algebra tutor.
Yeah.
I'm not in the target market for that.
Yeah.
And I honestly am having a bit of a hard time thinking about how to think about that, because I'm so used to building products where I'm going to poke at the product, I'm going to do things with the product, I'm going to complain when it doesn't work, because I'm a user of the thing. So that's a place where I probably in a correct self-analysis, I shouldn't be doing things that I'm not the potential user of.
Yeah.
And I as I say, I've seen this both in myself and in other people, when it's kind of like, I can do this, it's kind of easy, it's a thing that I can sort of turn the crank and do it. That's not necessarily, for me, that's not the right thing to do. I mean, I one thing that's happened, I suppose, in my life is I'm always doing difficult stuff. And that's not because I want to do difficult stuff particularly, but it's because I'm always reaching a bit further, and that always turns out to be difficult. I mean, sometimes there are projects where, I don't know, some projects I've done recently have been easier than expected.
Yeah.
And that's a win as far as I'm concerned. It's not a need to do something difficult.
Yeah.
It's just that I'm always trying to reach as far as possible, which inevitably ends up with difficulty, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I have one more topic, and then rapid fire questions, which are going to be very quick, and then we're going to open the Q&A.
I'm terrible at quick.
The point of the rapid fire questions is to get them quickly. So you either say.
Let's see what happens.
But first, one more thing. Also, surprising amount of people are interested in your intuition. I'm very surprised by all the questions, but also many people ask about your intuition. So when do you rely on your intuition? Has it in general been a good way to make decisions, or has it gone wrong sometimes? And how did you develop your intuition?
Developed my intuition from experience, basically. I mean, it's kind of like a lot of intuition about scientific kinds of things came from doing computer experiments, seeing how things worked out. I mean, my intuition about business, a lot of that is history. I've seen how things work, and I think that's the number one source. Yes, I rely on it all the time. I mean, that's, you're making business decisions. You're just like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Somebody can say, well, we could do a study of this and we could measure all this and that thing. Most of those things, it's mush in the end. It's like, well, it's 48% this, 52% that. Oh, but we had a measurement error, and we can't really tell what's going on. In the end, it's just like you have to just decide based on what you think. Now, in terms of science and so on, I feel like I've developed a really pretty good intuition. I mean, I feel like when I started out doing science, when I was a mid-teenager, I was okay in terms of intuition, but I made some mistakes in terms of intuition at that time. I think I got much better. And I think, now when I sort of believe that something is true, it typically really is true. And although it may take a while to get to knowing that it's true. And I'm pretty good at, another thing that I found useful is I'm pretty good at knowing when I know, so to speak, and also knowing when I don't know. And that's relevant in both business and research. Is like, look, I'm not, with business, sometimes it's like, I don't know what to do in this particular case. I'm not going to make a definitive decision here because I actually don't know. And similarly in research, it's like, do I know what I'm talking about or not? And once I think I know what I'm talking about, I really do typically. And it's something that it takes a certain amount of self-confidence to get to that point, because you have to, it's very easy for people, well, in business as well, there's often situations where it's like the experts tell you X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think we were talking about this before. I have this sort of principle that I've developed. If I don't understand it, I don't believe it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
people, people will tell you, oh, we're the expert in this or that. And, it's like, well, tell me why you think that. And they can tell you this and this and this. And eventually, either they hit a brick wall and they just say, I'm just the expert, I'm telling you this. And it's like, if you can't explain it, I'm just not going to believe it. That stood me in good stead for the last, I don't know, 50 years or so, since I pretty much adopted that point of view. I would say that I've rarely been led astray by that. And I would have been led astray horribly. And I've seen other people horribly led astray by the experts say this or that. And we just followed the experts.
I adopted that as one of my axioms the day you said it.
Good.
Okay.
So,
now I want to do a rapid fire question on, but before that, would you like to tell the audience here or the audience here anything, any message? If nothing comes to mind, it's also fine.
No, there's nothing. There are too many things. I could yak on forever about lots of things. But okay, now try see whether you can extract fast answers to things.
Okay, so the point of doing the rapid fire question round is that we get through these questions quickly. It's 7 questions, and so it's either you give us the answer no, or you choose to not answer. So I'd rather have you not answer than.
All right. Then okay, let's see how we
Okay,
do.
I know it's hard, but okay. Top 3 reading or book recommendations that influenced your thoughts the most. Doesn't have to be a book, could also be papers or whatever.
I'm not a great. I have a lot of books. I'm not a great reader of books from beginning to end type thing. I would say that
Papers are also fine, or blog posts, or
I'm too self-involved and self-generated. Back back when I was a kid, I used to read lots of physics papers. That was influential, but I have to say, I think I built my own, mythology, so to speak,
okay.
that I'm operating within. I'm not. I find, there've been many individual fragments of things that I've learned from lots of places and many fragments from lots of people, but I'm not like, this is the book that sort of got me on this path. I'm trying to think whether there's anything like that.
We can move on to the next one. You can tell us
Lots
later.
no, yeah, right. I don't have a good answer for that.
Okay, that's fine. This one's also going to be just as hard. Top 3 most interesting historical people or biographies you think we should study. I know you've been doing a lot of history of science. Can maybe just tell us a few top of mind that we think that you think are worth studying, that are interesting historical figures, maybe even from a very long time.
I mean, the ones I happen to have studied, but it's hard to know. I find it useful to study historical biography of scientists and so on, because you see how they got to where they got to, and that has certain resonance. That can have certain resonance with things that you face yourself, or not, as the case may be. Some of them, they're very different personalities and very different times, and so again, I'm going to wimp out on that, that
Okay,
question.
fine. Okay, so also a hard one. Okay, number 1 thing you wish you learned earlier in your career that you only learned later that would have been very useful to have known earlier.
I mentioned one before, which was that I'm not as clueless about running businesses and things as I thought I would be. So in other words, it's a thing about knowing about oneself. It's kind of like the things that are most useful to me are things about, you know, I mean, other than that, I suppose, oh boy, I mean, in uh, I always think that, you know, from when I was growing up, I always think I'll finally get to this place where sort of there'll be a lot of things to know that I don't know about, and that are really, it's like, oh my gosh, why didn't I know this before type thing. And it's certainly the case that over my life, there are many things where I really was pretty clueless earlier on, and I slowly got to learn those things. But this kind of, oh gosh, I wish I'd had this particular thing. I mean, there was a period of time when I seemed to mostly hang out around 80 and 90-year-olds because I kind of felt, I was going to learn something from, and then they kept on saying to me, young fellow, you have things much more figured out than we ever did. So I kind of gave up on that. It's always good to be, considered the young fellow in the whole thing. But so I've not. Uh, I mean, um, no. I mean, I again, I'm wimping out on
Well,
that.
you gave us an answer this time. You gave us the answer that you're about the business thing and
Yes.
don't believe it if you don't understand it. Okay. Now this is easy. Was there really a bet with your mother on who would write a book first? Someone
I
told me that,
don't
I think.
think so. I mean, I
Think
don't
so?
think so.
Who told me that? One of you told me that. I
The,
remember. I don't
I
know.
mean, I can't remember when did my mother write her first book? I'm trying to think. That must have been um hmm. I probably had written a book. She didn't start writing books until quite late in her life.
Okay.
So I started earlier in my life.
Okay.
So the one thing that just happened, I was wondering when this would happen, is we both had the same first initial. Okay. So there are two, and it was the question is when would the two Dr. S. Wolframs get confused? And it hadn't happened forever and ever and ever. And it just happened about 6 months ago. There's a archive of philosophy papers, and they are irreducibly confused. And they have my papers and my mother's papers totally mixed up. So it finally happened after all these years.
Okay. One more hard question, then one more easy question. I'm sorry, that's another hard question. Are there the Stephen Wolfram axioms? Like, don't believe it if you don't understand it. Have you ever written something like that down, or do you have any
I
ideas of what
probably should, but I haven't. I mean, it's kind of a I suppose I have things that I kind of return to as uh, I mean, yeah, there are things. Okay, there are things like, you know, um, sort of don't do things you should do. Don't do things that you shouldn't do, so to speak. Do things where you never feel bad about having done them, so to speak.
Yeah.
Sometimes more difficult to do the right thing, but sort of, I tend to adopt the point of view, always do that. I guess it makes me feel better, and that would be an example of a kind of a somewhat axiomatic thing for me. I mean, it's kind of uh, they're mostly, let me think. I mean, and these points about, always get to the point where you can explain things is
Yes.
another kind of thing that I consider somewhat axiomatic. I mean, I would say that another thing for me is always try and use my own tech.
Yeah.
That's another, axiomatic thing. Always try and use my own ideas. I had an experience. I think I was 17 years old. I was working on some physics problem, and was kind of like I was trying to figure out, something about cosmic rays and the moon and I don't know what. And I needed some calculation in physics. And I was like, oh, I can look at these papers that might have some calculation here. And I realized, what the heck? I just wrote this paper about this very topic
Yeah.
that, actually became quite well-known paper. And like, why am I not using my own thing? Why am I? And so what the main point there, which is sort of an interesting point perhaps, is that somehow it felt fragile to me because I knew I'd built it.
Yeah.
And so it was like, well, I know what its foundations are. I know it has these various problems. And, it's like believe in your own stuff
Yes.
so that you can actually build on it. Because what happens otherwise is, people for example, with ideas and academia and so on, there'll be a first generation that knows what sort of what the foundational questions are.
Yes, yes.
And then after a while, sort of the next generation has forgotten what those foundations are, and everything is just assumed.
Yeah.
And it's but the first generation people, when you talk to them, are always like, well, we're a little tentative because we understand the foundations and we know that there are places where it feels like it's built on sand, so to speak.
Yeah.
Whereas the later people are just like, oh, that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if you're a first generation person doing these things, you actually can get further if you can like just assume that that made sense. Now build on it.
Yes.
I mean, the thing that I've really noticed is you go from an idea, a little raw idea, to the development of the idea, and you have to, you know, for me, there are often these like 5-10 year gaps when the idea has to kind of settle before I feel comfortable, you know, building the next level on top of it. And I think you know, it's kind of like, okay, first you have some idea that, you know, there might be something like the Ruliad. Okay, I'm still adapting to that. And then there'll be things that you can build on top of that that are really quite big things that you can build, but you have to absolutely believe in that foundational thing in order to be prepared to build. And so it's another kind of believe in your own stuff, which is very difficult, by the way.
Yeah.
It's and okay, I have another. You asked me for these axioms.
We love
I'll
the
give you
axioms.
another one.
We love the axioms.
Another one is, you know, when you're doing science, you've got to let the chips fall where they will. What do I mean by this? You know, whenever you think about doing some science investigation, you have some prejudice about how it's going to come out. Otherwise, you wouldn't even start doing it.
Yeah.
But then you do it, and you might keep on saying, wait a minute, the chips are falling in the wrong direction. Let me push them a little bit in the direction I want them to go in. That's a big mistake. You've got to just do it as straight as you can. The chips will fall where they fall, and you have to be psychologically okay with that.
Yeah.
Because it might disprove the thing that you were sort of got into the problem, you know, into the project trying to prove. And, you know, you have to be prepared to psychologically let go to the point where you allow the chips to fall where they fall. My experience has been, first of all, I'm much more interested in what's actually true than whether my particular prejudice happened to be true.
Yeah.
But that's a non-trivial psychological place to get to.
Yes.
And you have to have done, I mean, for me, I've done enough stuff that I feel like if the next thing that I try to do doesn't happen to come out the way I thought it would come out, it's like, well, it's okay. You know, it's not a big deal. And if I did think it was a big deal, I might have a much harder time with that. But the thing that's happened, which is kind of interesting to me, is often the chips fall where I didn't expect them to fall. But then I realize, and it might take me 6 months or a year or more to realize it, actually, those chips were much more aligned with what I really thought than I ever imagined.
Yeah.
So, for example, a good example, this big example of this is, you know, I'm a people-oriented person. So I'm interested in people and this and that and the other. Yet many things I've done are deeply kind of deconstructive of the world. Like, you know, everything is made of hypergraphs and it's all, you know, it's all at some level sort of humanly meaningless. And so, you know, I didn't like that at some level. I was like, that's wrong because, you know, my prejudice is that I care about people and it's kind of sort of a human story and so on. And then what turns out to be true is in the end, it really is a human story. It really does matter what observers are like and so on. I didn't see that coming. I mean, you know, as far as I was concerned, it was like I had a prejudice, the chips fell a different way, and that's where they're falling. So it happens that it sort of came back to the other side, but that wasn't what I had imagined. And it wasn't, you know, I was just following the science where the science took one, so to speak.
Yeah. I would have loved to make your axioms explicit. I think you have many axioms that are implicit that it's very hard to actually, you probably think of them when it comes when the time comes, but it's very hard to make them explicit. Yeah. Anyways, last question and most important question of the interview. Would you like to join the Wolfram Running Club?
Oh,
We've been running every morning at 7 a.m.
Boy.
And many people have joined already.
Here's the problem. Number one, I wake up at 11 a.m.
Oh no.
That's one problem, and I'm a creature of ridiculous habit. So point one. Point two, I think I'm old and decrepit, and I do walk, but you know, I try to walk. In fact, the last few days I've not been making my walking quota, so I got to do some walks with some people later today. But you know, most of the time, every single day, I'll walk 10,000, 12,000 steps or something.
Pretty good.
But I don't I don't know whether I don't know whether I'm sort of provisioned for running at this point.
Okay.
It's the interesting question. I haven't tried doing it for a very, very long time.
Thank you very much for your time, and please pardon me for rushing you so much, but I have to get through the topics.
Good.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.